Conversation is a varied phenomenon. Ideally, a conversation is between two or more people and involves a back and forth exchange of experience and ideas. The best conversations involve a mutual connection and active listening to the content of the speaker's words, including a reading of their body language and their tone of voice. Psychologists estimate the words to be the smallest part of human verbal communication, some 7% of the total, while body makes up almost 2/3 and a big 30-odd% is tone of voice. Weirdly, we are apparently better at dealing with deception with no body visible, relying largely on tone. For the purpose of playing an RPG, I believe we need to consider all aspects of that mix: words, tone, and body. To me, it's easier to read the table when I can see the participants and clearly hear their voices. Online games restrict the amount of body language and somewhat distort the tone of voice, making it a tougher experience to pay attention to. But the clue is that the body and tone are a big part of what goes into the playing of an RPG. Thus, you can tell when a player is participating in a manner which is out of sync with the group. For example, the player who is joking around when the rest of us are wanting to experience a more serious tone. And listen to the use of language there. The tone of the experience is coloured by the tone of voice and bodily expression. Perhaps this is why text-only RPG experiences leave me much colder than fully embodied experiences. To the content of the conversation in terms of words, I would say that first and foremost comes the description and invocation of the world, the setting within which the experience of the player characters will take place. Alongside this is the description and invocation of those characters. Interestingly, this invocation can be purely verbal, but is enriched, at least in my experience, by the inclusion of tone and body movement that is congruous to the description. That said, I find extremes of body involvement, such as dressing up or physical props, distracting from the invocation of the character and the situation in my imagination. I believe that role-playing games have a variety of ritualized methods, the choice of which structures the conversation to help form it into a game experience. All games have structures. You might go as far to state it as a sequence of play, but role-playing games are extremely flexible in being able to function within a wide range of methods, structures, and procedures. These methods are distinct from and additional to the use of rules. The basic conversational structure between two people is that you speak while I listen, then I respond to what you have said while you listen, and we repeat this pattern. RPGs build on this conversational structure, perhaps with formalized turn-taking as with a board game, or perhaps with a less formalized and more fluid methodology, but structure is there nonetheless. My own preference is for the RPG to include formal rules to adjudicate questions which arise from the player's choices of action, reaction, or interaction within the game. Simply put, this is a method by which ambiguous questions can be clarified. For example, can Grek the Barbarian smash open that reinforced door with a bar across the inside? One player says yes, while the other says no. Perhaps a neutral arbiter, say the roll of the dice against some odds, can break this tie. For me, the use of the rules does not have to be verbalized and can dwell in the realm of the body language, the visual channel, as it were, within the conversation. You roll dice and we see the outcome, but nobody needs to describe what we see on the table in the primary world. We can instead translate this information into description in the secondary world. Grek slams his shoulder into the door and bounces off, bruising his upper arm. What we can include in the conversation is information that is not directly pertinent to the description and invocation of the fantastic world and characters or their actions within it. My sense is that extraneous content distracts from and blurs the experience of an RPG. Thus, quotes from film, talk of current events, texting one's partner, and other non-game specific topics are best excluded from the play. That said, sometimes players need to pay attention to real physical human needs, such as going to the toilet or eating and drinking. So breaks and the monitoring of clock time can be beneficial to the minimizing of those kinds of topics. We can reduce the communication requirements of the RPG for sure. I suspect that we can reduce the conversation down to mere words on a page or screen to communicate and invoke the world and the characters, such as in a play-by-post game. The degree to which this impacts the enjoyment of the game is going to be subjective, a subjective matter and unique for each participant. I have played in a play-by-post game, admittedly for only 3 or 4 turns, with only the description of the world, the characters and the activities within that world. No rules content, all of that have been out of view. I got bored and I did not enjoy the experience because for me, being blind to the players and deaf to their tone of voice was too much of a reduction of the conversation. That said, I do enjoy more focus on the description and invocation of the world and characters, but a reduction in the obvious employment of methods and rules alongside that. In other words, if the DM takes the method, i.e. game structures and procedures, and the rules mechanisms behind the screen, I am less distracted by them as a player. But I mostly GM, and I enjoy managing those elements for my players, dialing their respective opacity to the people in front of me. My view is that you could run a role-playing session with just the dialogue of description and a basic method of play, such as turn-taking and allowing the GM to fiat all the adjudications. That is to say, one person can be made to decide on those questions whose outcomes have high stakes but which are ambiguous. Like Grek's shoulder on the door. This would be focused and seamless in terms of the conversation, but experience tells me that a player who does not agree with the GM's decisions when it comes to something high stakes might end their participation in the game. Thus, I've found dice as a randomizer or even a card deck and some kind of basic rules mechanism for deciding odds a valuable tool for adjudication of the game. I think the system, the rules, act as a participant in the conversation answering ambiguous questions. System actively decides outcomes one way or the other, or at least on a spectrum, and it informs the adjudication of action, reaction, and interaction in the described world. I believe that method, the agreed upon format of play, is a supporting medium which shapes the conversation, giving it boundaries and limits and channeling it in certain directions, much as the topography of the land guides the flow of water that becomes a river. The river is the meeting of the two, and the game is the meeting of these people within this certain set of methods. For solo play, I think method and system form a larger part of the conversation because they offer a voice to a silent and non-corporeal imagined partner in the play. For me, solo GM emulation is much like having an imaginary friend who helps me adjudicate and provides suggestions for me to riff off at the table. Solo has a more limited range of human voices, only the 2 inside myself, and thus benefits from other tools. And yes, I did say 2 voices. There's the voice of my character and the voice of me as the player, but the character does not interact with the tools of the game. It's kind of hard to explain.
The difference between a verbal exchange and RPG play. What makes a conversation different when it's for playing an RPG compared to just talking or writing? A TTRPG conversation is distinct because it isn't just about exchanging ideas. Again, if a conversation is an exchange of ideas, a TTRPG isn't just about exchanging ideas. It's about collaboratively building, maintaining, and altering a shared imagined space according to structured rules. Regular conversation lacks the persistent consequences and structured influence that define RPG play, meaning the structure being the rules and the system, the action adjudication system. So for a conversation to be an RPG session, the information exchanged must contribute to the shared imagined space, uphold the game's structured framework, and maintain meaningful interaction. So purely mechanical talk without world engagement weakens the experience, just as excessive off-topic discussion can disrupt. So again, talking and writing enable RPG play by converting internal imagination into shared, structured exchange by synchronicity, ensuring that both role-playing and game mechanics function within a collaborative space. While talking allows fluid, dynamic play, writing provides permanence and structure, making both viable mediums depending on the game's format. You can't have a role-playing game, and I say this cautiously, but you can't have a role-playing game without the conversation piece, right? So that's the externalization of the internal framework, and you need both. You need the internal framework, and you need the externalization. Without either of those pieces, you don't have a role-playing game. RPG communication can be simplified to the point where it functions without additional tools or media. However, doing so requires 3 core elements to be preserved. Number 1, the shared imagined space. Players must collectively maintain and modify a mental model of the game's world, that being the shared imagined space. 2, a structured system of action resolution. There must be a way to determine what happens when uncertainty arises. 3, a means of synchronizing player contributions. Communication must be clear enough to allow players to react meaningfully to each other's input. As long as these 3 aspects remain intact, an RPG can theoretically be played using nothing but spoken conversation. Conversation alone is sufficient for an RPG. However, this assumes the internal framework. There must be, and when I say internal framework, I mean apart from the game systems, there must be an internal framework. We can get into this during the conversation about the conversation. But I also want to say that most games will benefit from additional tools to support fairness, memory, and complexity. The need for external tools is going to depend on how much structure and randomness the particular game demands. So pure storytelling RPGs require fewer tools, where heavy mechanical RPGs are going to need more because they become more difficult to track from moment to moment. Should we consider the game system as a participant in the conversation, a tool, or just part of the information exchanged during play? I found this question to be the most exciting, and I will say then the most accurate perspective on this question is a hybrid. The system functions as a tool because we use it to facilitate play. It shapes the conversation like a participant by introducing independent constraints and mechanics that will push back on players. And it is exchanged information because its rules are referenced, interpreted, and sometimes debated. So when it is the conversation, it is the information exchanged. So thus, the system is not just one of these things. It's all 3 at different times. So again, when it pushes back against the player intent, it acts as a silent participant. When it's used to resolve uncertainty, it's a tool. And when it is referenced and discussed, it is exchanged information. So this will allow us to understand how different RPGs lean more heavily toward one role or another. Like rules light games treat the system more as information, while crunchier games are going to make it a more active participant. So I think that the answer is maybe unsatisfyingly, but I think very satisfyingly, all of the above.
I've been developing and using my role-playing game Primeval Fantasy for years, which one day I'll release into the wild. It's helpful to say from the onset that my answers all concern my explicit tools for uniting the players with their characters as much as possible, and methodology is primary for this. There's also a clear divide between the purpose and function of GMs versus players. So the difference between a standard verbal exchange and role-playing exchanges, where the former may or may not have a goal or agenda with restrictions to the conversation, role-playing game conversation should have that clear and explicit goal. For the players, it's to be united with their PCs as they explore a tangible other world. To the degree that all the parties are committed to that goal, all the conversations occurring during the sessions should be in service to that. And so addressing the types of information, it's all about the pursuance of that goal, which can be divided between the players and the GMs. Ideally, the players are talking as their PCs and describing their PC's actions exactly as they imagine they're performing them. For the in-character speaking part, it means, for fantasy worlds at least, eschewing themselves, our modern idioms, and trying to speak in the same fashion, even with the same vocabulary and mindset, as their player characters. For describing their actions, it should entail, most of the time at least, specific granular descriptions rather than summaries. For example, not, I searched through the ruins for the remnants of the shield, but instead, I walk to that corner of the ruins, start lifting branches and stones out of the way, and so on. For GMs, it means doing everything to maximize the player's unity of perspective with their characters. All the information given to the players should be only what is perceived and believed by their characters and from their points of view, never anything meta. Summaries of information are sometimes given to those PCs if they already know something which the players may have forgotten. For example, in this city, you already know that the fishermen do such and such at a particular time. I also have to mention here that I've become a strong proponent of what was traditionally called rules opacity, where the mechanics are hidden from the players. And so the types of information exchanged never involve any system mechanics whatsoever. Players describe all their actions, and when needed, GMs adjudicate using mechanics, but describing only with real-world verbiage. Is conversation sufficient? Maybe, but I doubt it. We are often helped with other tools like sketching out the layout of a village or a campsite. It's quite difficult to be on the same page about such places with words alone. Just compare the difference of trying to verbally explain the layout of our homes versus even a crude sketch. So I think that numerous visual aids can often help significantly. System, if by that you mean mechanics, is important, but just for adjudications, physics and cause and effect. As I said, the players use and see none of that, at least while they're playing in session. And GMs never relay any such information. Everything is three-dimensional descriptions.